Hello, everyone. My name is Michelle from the Architectural Association of Kenya, and I'd like to invite you to this webinar. Every electioneering period, AK runs a campaign on the Kenya We Want, and this is just part of the Kenya We Want campaign that we've been conducting over this election period. So the campaign entails 5 sections. We have urban governance, reformed urban governance, climate justice, sustainable infrastructure development, and all that. So affordable housing is within the sustainable urban development. And this is a vision that we'd want the incoming government to focus on. So our host will be taking us through the beginning of the session, and then we'll have architect Arabu, who will be our moderator, and he'll introduce the various speakers we have for the day, for the evening, that is. So Sana, we have on your far right, you have the tweet icon where you can ask your questions, and when answer session, you can request to speak and you'll be given permission to be a speaker. So feel free to engage with us as we continue with the conversation. Karibu, Marilyn, over to you.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this AK Twitter space. Affordable housing in Kenya, lessons for the new government. Shelter is a basic need and the backdrop against which all our activities and living are usually staged. So understanding this fact, politicians have had housing among the highest ranking campaign promises. If you look at the United States of America, for example, in Joe Biden's campaign, there was a promise that was made to establish a 100 billion US dollar affordable housing fund to construct and upgrade affordable housing. In the year and 8 months or so that he has been in office, nothing much seems to have happened to this end. And here at home, the outgoing government had as one of its Big Four agenda the affordable housing program. And the target was 500,000 homes between December of 2017 and June of 2022, with a total spend of about 127 billion Kenya shillings, which was supposed to finance actual building of houses, the infrastructure around them, that is roads, water, and so on, and providing access to cheap credit, ostensibly to make mortgages more attractive to potential homeowners. Now, this is not the first attempt by a sitting Kenyan government to provide affordable housing, because between 2009 and 2012, in the first medium-term plan of Vision 2030, the government had actually targeted an increase of housing production from 35,000 units annually to 200,000 units. However, the 2017 World Bank Economic Update gave the score at only 3,000 units that were delivered in that entire period between 2009 and 2012. When you fast forward to 2022, the State of Housing Report, which is by the Economic and Social Rights Center, Hakijamii, gives the score at only 13,529. This is against the target of 500,000 affordable housing units, and with a minimal delivery on the social housing category. So, what is the difference between affordable housing and social housing? Affordable housing is housing that's provided to a range of household incomes whose needs are not being met by the market. So it's usually available to a broader range of household incomes than social housing because the word affordable implies a sliding scale. So as affordability varies among households, so does the type of affordable housing that can be provided. Social housing, on the other hand, is specifically provided for those households that are least able to fund themselves, and it's often provided by national and local governments, and usually on a rental basis, with the ownership remaining with the government. So, affordable housing can be provided either by the government or by an incentivized private sector, as has been the with our outgoing government. And why is it important that we have a conversation tonight? We live in a democracy, and democracy is about holding our government accountable and being informed about what our government is doing for us, or at least should be doing for us. However, holding our government accountable is not only about pointing fingers and highlighting poor performance. For our accountability holding to be effective, we need to provide support to the government and we need to encourage learning. So we need to reflect on challenges and failures and to also give our recommendations. So we hope that this discussion we have put together tonight can serve as a springboard for the next government on these matters of affordable and social housing. Thank you for joining us, and I hope that we do have an engaging session. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Marilyn, for sharing the opening stroke welcoming remarks. Also for the brief definitions on affordable versus social housing. I would like to now request us to move to the second session. The second part of our night would be the panel discussion, which will be moderated by Architect Arabu Ndege, who is also the chairperson of the Architects chapter of the Architectural Association of Kenya, AAK, and also the convener of Dream Cities. Karibu sana, Architect Arabu. You may proceed with the panel discussion as you welcome your various speakers.
Good evening. I hope I'm audible enough. I think I lost network at some point. I'm also trying to look through the attendees to see whether my entire panel is available. But nonetheless, I'm going to just go ahead and introduce them. I have no less than 7 lined up speakers. I will just quickly give you a highlight of there, and then I'll go one by one asking them a question which they can respond to. I hope that if someone is just to join, maybe I can get assistance from AK Secretariat to try to reach them out to them and get them on board. The first speaker we are going to have, or rather, let me just say it, not necessarily any order, but just for purposes of how I've put them here on my question sheet. I have the Permanent Secretary Charles Hinga, Principal Secretary, the State Department of Housing and Urban Development. I have Architect Eta Madete, who's an age expert, affordable housing lead at the Build X Studio, and women state. She's a member of WIRE, a board member, I believe. I also have Professor Alfred Omenya, who's no stranger to this space and AK in general, who is a sustainable human settlements expert. We are going to have Mrs. Sandra Oyombe, who is the program manager. Let me say Miss. I don't want to assume. I know her title. Mrs. Sandra Oyombe, who's a program manager, lands and housing at Haki Jamii. We will have our fifth speaker as Miss Flora Mudhaura. Ms. Mudhaura is from the Kenya Mortgage Finance Company, and she is the head of risk and compliance. We will have Ms. Scholastica Chekoech as well from the Kenya Mortgage Finance Company, and she's a credit officer. And finally, we will have Mr. Mark Okundi from Habitat for Humanity Kenya, which is part of the Habitat for Humanity International, and he's a communications and advocacy officer. So allow me, I don't know whether PS is here, as PS joined us. Anyone? Sorry, Olo, are you able to clarify that? I don't think I can see him on the boost.
Hi, Rabu. He's yet to join, but we can just proceed, and maybe he'll get us as we continue.
All right, that's in order. So maybe as it comes, just to let the members, the question we wanted to look at was to do with the most important lesson. He, as head of the Big Four agenda, affordable housing, would have liked to look at that and address what are the lessons they're looking at and how they're planning to transition to the next government's actions. So let me go to my second speaker. Eta is here, Eta Madete, architect. And Eta, I would like you to just come in now and address the issue of design elements and which are the critical design elements that promote inclusivity and health in mass housing. And maybe just look at it in terms of the available regulations and bylaws. Are they sufficient enough to ensure that we get inclusive and healthy housing? Heta, Karibu.
Thank you, AK and Arabu and the speakers who are going to speak with me in this panel. Thank you too to the listeners here. I see we have a good quorum to speak on this really important issue. On my end, I'll speak briefly about approaches to inclusivity and sustainability when it comes to affordable housing and some of the limitations that exist as a practitioner, as somebody trying to deliver affordable housing, also as a theoretician, because I teach at the University of Nairobi, and as somebody who is passionate about affordable, sustainable, and inclusive housing. It's not a simple question to answer, Bonarabu, because inclusivity in affordable housing encompasses the entire broad spectrum, from ensuring financial access to the neglected and the marginalized communities, whether it is to do with gender marginalization, discrimination when it comes to different types of race, different types of communities, different types of financial access, whether it's low income versus high income communities. So financial access enables inclusivity in the affordable housing space. The second what you wanted me to on is on physical access, is the space that we are designing inclusive for all communities. Inclusivity when it comes to physical access is not only dealing with wheelchair access, which is the first aspect that people think about, it is dealing with less abled, disabled, and all forms of disabilities, whether physical or sensory. And in that way, it challenges the affordable housing sector to first start off ensuring that all voices are at the table from the beginning. Inclusivity begins not at the design of your door when you're doing your door schedules, or when you're doing your ramp, or when you're trying to decide whether to put a lift or not. Inclusivity starts from the very beginning at ensuring that the people designing the spaces, producing the products that you consider housing, have the right eyes. So do you have eyes of people who understand disability and how to work with that? Not just, as I said, physical disability, but sensory. Are you working with the right technicians when it comes to the material specifications for slip, when you're looking at physical disability, as well as tactility for, visual disability? Are you looking at the right signage? Are you looking at the right heights of where you put your fixtures and your fittings? What are the different considerations that you need to make at the very onset of having the right voices around the table? And in that fact, listing the stakeholders that are required in these spaces is the first step. And then secondly, we look at the team that is actually working on the project. The team that is actually working, is it included, that comes from different genders, from different communities? Now that you've identified who will use this space, sometimes as architects and as practitioners, we need to challenge the clients to make sure that they're not just thinking of the rental income or the return on investment. We need to challenge them to think about who are the buyers of these spaces, and identifying them, defining the personas, and ensuring that we're clear that we have thought about everyone who might use the space. And in affordable housing, dealing with the bottom 40%, dealing with low income housing, and even social housing, the first thing that comes off the table is this inclusivity and sustainability, which enables the well-being of the users. I can speak from experience that the margins in affordable housing are so tight that the developer is feeling pressed to make sure that, first of all, they're able to deliver on time, that they're able to deliver to the right quality, but also to make sure that they're not making a loss. So beginning to push for this at the very beginning enables the affordable housing developer to input inclusivity and sustainability in the original feasibility, in the original financial model, so it is not left out. Inclusivity goes further down the chain when it comes to design. As I mentioned, and you also asked me to talk on this, the building code and the bylaws. Right now, we have a new that has been commissioned for 2022, that's been validated, building code. And in all building codes all around the world, the thing that is listed is the what. Like, what do you need to do? What is the sort of width? What is the turning radius? The technical specifications. And usually it's about a paragraph, or it's like 5 or 6 clauses that give almost technical advice. And in that regard, what happens is that disability and inclusivity when it comes to physical access of the space is then limited specifically to this idea of dealing with a wheelchair. And that again begins to limit the idea of how do we ensure that this physical space is inclusive. When it comes to gender inclusivity, for example, it is not just about wheelchair access. It's not just about, often disparaged idea of like having the right size of kitchen. No, when it comes to gender inclusivity, the idea of safety, security, visibility, eyes on the street, eyes on the common areas, access when it comes to different kinds of vehicles and facilities, different kinds of movements that all genders require is just as important. In addition, when it comes to now physical disability, as I mentioned, there's sensory consideration. What are the heights? What are the colors you're using? What are the materials that you're using that enable tactility, so that somebody who's less visually impaired can move through the space without difficulty? What kind of signage are you using? Are you able to ensure that it is inclusive for all? What are the heights of some of your fixtures and fittings so that all people can access them in a comfortable way? So when it comes to physical disability and the space, the design portion of architecture requires us to make sure that we're asking the right questions and ensuring that the right answers are being produced in the product. As I'd mentioned, you start at the feasibility, but you make sure at the design that we include some of these features that everyone feels welcome and inclusive in the space. We are also extremely passionate about inclusive construction practices, inclusive and sustainable. And in this, it also ensures that not only when it comes to sort of the transparency, transparency and inclusivity when it comes to your recruitment procedures on sites, as well as in your design team, transparency in terms of promotion criteria, transparency on salary scales, transparency on how you deal with harassment and different policies you have in place, just making sure those are there. But also, is your construction site conducive for all genders, all communities? Do you have, for example, a prayer room? I know this is something you might not think about on your construction site. It's a bit uncomfortable because that means that maybe it becomes difficult for people of a certain community or religious affiliation to work on these projects. And as I mentioned, inclusivity is not just about a wheelchair. Inclusivity is encompassing the entire design process of product delivery, and affordable housing is the key driver of social economic change that can begin to drive these as well. So inclusive construction practices, including how you design your site, how many site offices and site spaces do you have for washrooms, how are you dealing with the visibility and security of these washrooms, how are you dealing with the site and safety security, harassment procedures, as I mentioned, that can apply also in the office, in the design office, as well as in the construction site. Lastly, I'll mention sales. When it comes down to the full development delivery, you need sales, marketing, and the legal procedures that enable an inclusive environment for homeownership for everyone. The most important thing when it comes to inclusivity is that if you handle and you do have policies, spaces, procedures, designs that are encompassing to everyone, the most vulnerable and the most neglected population are well represented, then it works for everyone. And so it's not wasted effort, it's not extra effort, it's not, oh, we're only dealing with a small percent. Does not give us the excuse to neglect and to not be inclusive. So when it comes to the legal process, I'll mention that I think less than 2% land title under a woman's name as we stand. Yet over 40% of the households in Kenya are headed by women. So there's a huge gap in trying to address ownership. And that also starts from the developer, it starts from the private and the public sector to sort of, again, begin to challenge the information we're sharing. What is the kind of information we're sharing when we're doing sales and marketing? Who are we targeting, especially in the low income segment? A lot of the affordable housing, sometimes I question it. All the legal jargon is in English, but I'm wondering, is that the most comfortable language that many people that we're trying to attract to these affordable housing projects can consume? A 10-page agreement for lease. That's a question that we need to begin asking in terms of inclusivity. Can we talk about the language in our legal procedure and the way that we enable accessibility in that way? Can we talk about the language we use in our sales and marketing when it comes to home ownership and enable a way that all people feel like they can take ownership and feel like they're part of this movement that we're trying to change. When it comes to the new government, because that's also something that we are discussing in this forum, of course, I've been very keen as somebody passionate about affordable and sustainable housing to look at whether affordable housing will be brushed under the rug. Maybe the PS can also speak on this as well. But I can see that in every single government globally, housing is always a key item. And how our housing is approached is the problem. At the moment, housing in both the manifestos, in the possibly, I'm not going to sway in either, are bunched together again. And that was the original problem. And that's why this last big agenda made housing a key thing. It is bundling housing with urbanization, bundling it with manufacturing, bundling it with other things. And it's important to sort of express housing in the context of this entire, economic ecosystem. But the minute you bundle housing with urbanization and complex structures such as manufacturing, then you end up losing the people. When it comes to housing, it's not a statistic, it's not a number, it is, the person, the persona. And that's the most key drive, sort of closing remark I want to make when it comes to inclusivity is that we must remember the people. Housing is about people, and people have personas, they have personalities, they have problems, they have things that they're struggling with. And we must understand the people to begin to really design more inclusive and sustainable housing. I'll end there.
Thank you, Eta. Just to remind panelists also that I have shared open questions in the WhatsApp group. There are 3 questions I want you to ponder upon. And of course, one of them you have alluded to, Eta, this is the issues of recommendations for the next government. So please just prepare that in your next session. But yes, just what I picked from there, very to begin with the issues of this inclusivity being very wide, a wide spectrum that need to be covered, and the issues of the voices being heard, both from the design team and also the client or the end users. Are they table when these decisions are being made? I would like to welcome, I see PS has joined us, so we will go back to the first question just to set the pace. PS, I already introduced you when you were away, but I wanted you to address this issue of the Jubilee government's Big Four agenda, and specifically on affordable housing. What can you say is the most important lesson that you've learned, and your team, of course, and that what is the government's specifically policies and incentives that developers and financiers and buyers have taken advantage of this PS Karibu?
Thank you very much, Program Director, and good evening, everybody. I hope you can hear me now.
Yes, you are very clear. Go ahead.
Thank you very much. So to start with, I think one of the perhaps biggest achievement in terms of what, and as a result of doing that, there's been that has taken place in the last, say, 4.5 years in this particular sector. To start with, I know, and most of you may not know, I was not part of the team that crafted the manifesto. I was sort of the team that came to implement the manifesto. And the fact that they put a number to sort of, and I think putting a number is good because you always use that to measure yourself as to the success. So one of the things that was important in my view was to first of all ask yourself the question. Here you have data that shows that you're doing about, if you look at the first MTP, medium-term plan of the Vision 2030, and an MTP is normally 3 years, and it showed that you had done 1,000 houses in 3 years under the affordable housing bracket. So the question that we needed to ask ourselves is, what is this silver bullet that you think you have that will move you from doing 1,000 houses in 3 years, to almost 200,000 or to 100,000 housing units a year? And that was always a very difficult target to achieve, because in our case, we have a situation whereby you have, since independence, we have had a broken sector, for lack of a better word. We have a sector which is very sensitive to very say about 5, 6, 7 key drivers. And it's not a case of solving one, then you solve everything. You have got any one of them. If you don't pay keen attention to any one of the 6 drivers, you will submarine. And just very quickly, just say maybe 4 of them that we identified as areas that we needed to address first before you can even start talking about affordable housing. One is just the issue of land and its entire ecosystem. Now, land is not just a factor of production in our sector. Land is everything, because housing has to be built on land. Now, land has so many challenges. One, it's expensive, very expensive. And I keep on citing this report about 2-3 years ago that came out and showed that Nairobi has the most expensive land in the continent. I think for a long time we were number 3, and now we overtook, I think Kampala was in Senegal, Dakar, if I'm not wrong. So we have the most expensive land in the continent, but in the same sentence, you want to have affordable housing. Now, this one particular factor was so important, because when you compare Kenya versus maybe other countries that have somehow managed, I wouldn't say that have addressed affordable housing, but at least they've made significant steps towards addressing issues of affordability. Land contributes between 10 and 15% to the overall cost of development. But in our case, land, when we looked at the numbers, was somewhere between 40 and sometimes up to 60% of the total of the entire development cost. That's the first issue that you need to address. The second issue that we identified was the cost of construction. The cost of construction was obscenely high. I have mentioned that in my first procurement that I did was for some police housing. And when we, as a PS, and when the tenders closed, and we had quite an array of submissions that we had, in some instances, we had those costs all in, some of them going as high as 70,000 per square meter. That's empirical data that we have. So when you have, if you assume that is an outlier, you still, even if you're at 50,000, 60,000, you're still very, very, very high. That is the cost of the delivered unit. And then you ask yourself, what is this that is driving this particular cost? One is because, we were still using traditional methods of construction. We were still doing what I will term as a bespoke type of development. And if you are to address the issue of affordable housing, you need to adopt industrial building techniques. You need to do mass production of housing. And that way you leverage large economies of scale. And that alone, you save anywhere between 15% of the overall cost by just adopting industrial building techniques. And you're able to build faster. But of course, in there you have got taxes that we had, which one of them, which is the most painful tax, is the VAT, because all of you will agree with me that VAT is particularly very painful for us in the built environment. Not because other sectors don't have VAT, but it's because on our side we have an input, but we don't have an output. So VAT in our case is an actual cost. You see, the other sectors, it is a timing cost. So yes, you pay today, but you will claim it tomorrow. In our sector, there is no claiming, because when you sell the units, you don't sell the units with VAT, and so therefore that in itself compounds the pain. But also bear in mind that of all the taxes, VAT is painful tax. Why painful tax? It is a painful tax because it's what we call a cash flow tax. You see, income tax, you only pay income tax once you have, sold and you've made a profit. VAT you pay today. Now you pay it now, whether you sell the units 3 years from now, it doesn't matter. So VAT was particularly a very painful tax. Then there were processes that were basically, each one of you who is a practitioner in this particular sector has been a victim of, building approval, the permits, whether it is with NCA, whether it is in NEMA, whatever the processes that you have got to go through. Even when you have got the money, you have sorted out the land issue, and assume now that even that your technology for construction, you've sort of figured it out, you still have to endure processes that just didn't make sense. Now, those processes, when you aggregate them, in our data, it showed that it added another about 15% to the cost of construction, to the overall cost of development. And then we had the issue of the financing, that is both on the supply side and the demand side. So on the demand side, you have got people who are willing and actually want to buy. One of the first things that we did when I became PA was we commissioned an exercise where we hired KPMG to do a bit of market study and put together for us. They actually did a lot of housing surveys. They if I'm not wrong, and I please forgive me for this because it's been a while. That was 2018. They surveyed so many houses, and I think about 4 million households or thereabout actually expressed an interest to have an affordable housing unit. So yes, we know we keep on saying, oh, the gap is about 2 million. But when the survey was actually done, somewhere between 4 and 5 million. So the will is there. Even look at what we did with Bomayangu when we allowed Kenyans to register themselves in their numbers, so that we can be able to to pent up demand. We had over 300, close to 330,000 Kenyans who had registered themselves, and about 40,000 of them were actually making a contribution and paying towards it. So I can go to many other, but I guess you sort of get the gist of the issue. And as you're still talking about that, there is something like the sanctity of titling that cuts across from the under land issues, but also processes, because the authenticity of that document that you have in itself was something that you needed to bear in mind. So therefore, when the way to sum it up is that we came into a place where we actually had a systemic failure, total systemic failure. And so therefore, this was the result, as this is what was producing these 1,000 units in 3 years, in the affordable housing particular sector. So I club it as land. And when you talk about land, you're also talking about servicing the land, because it's not just about any land. You must talk about land that is in places that is well serviced. If it's not serviced, it needs to be serviced. You need to talk about the cost of construction. You need to talk about the cost of all these processes, and the cost of financing, and both on the supply side and the demand side. Demand side, so I've spoken about it, in the supply side, you have got the how do you finance these developers. So having looked at all those plus other factors, we therefore came up with some guidelines as to how we be able to access and address some of these issues. And very quickly we determined that however you want to look at affordable housing, unless government is subsidizing the land, you will not be able to achieve what you call affordable housing. And in our definition of affordable housing was, you should not be spending, whichever income bracket you belong to, you should not be spending more than 30% of your disposable income, either towards renting or towards paying for a housing unit. So you are not going to be able to achieve it when you have such expensive land. So we say the first intervention is, can government then be able to provide subsidized land? And as a result, we went and did a very big exercise of mapping, land that belongs to government that could be made available for development. So that we did, and it formed part of the development framework guidelines. We then looked at the building code. We looked at the taxes, and we came up with an incentive package so that we can be able to lower the cost of construction. And I remember sitting with AAK at that time. The president was Madam Emma, and first of all, let me just say thank you very much to AAK. You've been very, very, very close partners along this particular journey. And at that time, we just had numbers just flying around, and I came to you as AAK, and I said, look, can you get your various chapters together? This is what define what you think affordable housing is, and then give us some ballpark numbers. What do you think be the ideal cost of construction? What should be the ideal cost of infrastructure, social infrastructure, and so on and so forth? And then what do you think should be the selling price? And you did that. You actually gave us those figures, which we religiously followed, and when we were comparing with our numbers, we were not too far away from that, but those particular those figures. So those went into putting together into what we call the development framework guidelines, because we felt that we needed to provide some guidelines for all the actors who wanted to participate in this particular sector. So for me, the biggest achievement in and especially the first 6-7 months, I must say that I have never worked so hard in my entire life. Even when I was in the private sector chasing money, never worked so hard than those first 6-7 months, trying to get the program well defined. Everything was all over the place, and getting through legislative processes, to just get a bill in how long it does, to get things sorted out by cabinet. And we achieved quite a lot. In those first 9 months, we had the development framework guidelines approved by cabinet. We had quite a number of legislations that were either before Parliament or in drafting process, and at the same time make sure that we had adequate public participation. So, come back to the question of what is this silver bullet that the Jubilee government then, and I think this was now answering a question, after the fact. Is what is this silver bullet that you have that makes you think that you can be able to move this needle from 3,000 units from 1,000 units in 3 years to 100,000 every year? And it all boiled down to financing and funding. Now, I want us all to bear in mind that we are talking about public housing in this particular case, because we still had the private sector, which was still producing for the 3% for the high end. The high end market, yes, we're still not addressing 100%, but that was still happening. So we need to look at all these developers who understand high end and now need to come and produce units for sort of the majority, which is the affordable housing side. So this is almost like a new asset class where you need to look at these investors and say, hey, hang on a second, you've been making money and in this year, but we think you can make even better money in this case. And the way we framed it was, look, you're not going to make more money per unit in affordable housing, but you can make a lot more money through scale, as opposed to making a ton lot of money on one unit, and you do maybe 10 units in a year. So that's somehow the way we framed it. Now, we looked at countries that had addressed the issues of affordable housing, and one thing was very, very, and that is they had a very rich saving culture. And I know around the elections time we like making examples of Singapore. But yes, we looked at the Singapore model, we looked at Mexico, we looked at Brazil, we looked at the US, we looked at, even within African context, we looked at Nigeria, Cameroon, we looked at China. We did quite an extensive benchmarking, and of course, without necessarily visiting those places. So the one thing that was very, 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 very clear is the role of saving and saving money as funds, that go into housing for what reason? And the reason is, and I know a lot of you disagreed with it. Some of you are very close friends of mine, and we simply just disagreed. And the disagreement was that we're in a country that we have one of the lowest savings to GDP in the world, and now we have put this huge mantle of we want to do 500,000 units, and you know very well that government has largely two sources of income. It is taxes, or it is debt. So that basically, if you're looking at a government-driven solution, it's those areas. So it's either we go and overtax the people, or on the other hand, it's either we go and we will overborrow. That's the reality. The third aspect of it is to try and mobilize private sector. But even when it comes to mobilizing private sector, it is you as I said, you're looking at people who've been producing for the millionaires and maybe the middle class and the high end, and now you're telling them, no, come and start building a unit that costs 1 million shillings and so on and so forth. They look at you and they say, why must I do that? And they look at the market and they say that is not going to happen. So we therefore made a decision that the only way we are able to address this particular issue was to look at a third factor, which is not tax and not debt. And that was a forced saving, right? It's a forced saving. And that's how we came up with the Housing Development Fund, National Housing Development Fund. Now, we didn't agree with a lot of you that was the way to go. But I still submit that I don't see that you will be able to address mass housing production if you do not have a housing fund. What are the reasons for that? As I said, you have a bunch of investors who are already making money, just doing 10 units a year, and their bottom line is okay. If they improve by 2 more units, they've outdone that particular year. Now you need to talk to those guys, because it's not like you're creating a new bunch of developers. And even if you're going to create a new bunch of developers, the issues of bankability, where they're going to get funding. So the first point of call is to go to people who are already doing it, who have a track record, and you try and interest them in this particular scheme. And more importantly, local developers, because when you bring in the foreign developers and investors, what is the first thing that they want? They want to take a lot of risks. So they come there and they say, look, I don't understand Kenyan people. I don't want to understand Kenyan risk. Just give me either a sovereign guarantee. Now, when you talk about sovereign guarantee, that adds to your debt. And so we try to work out on something that does not add to the debt, but at the same time gives comfort to investors. And that's how we came up with the Housing Development Fund. Unfortunately, in the year 2018, when National Treasury did the Finance Bill or the Finance Act, then they, I don't know why they use the word levy, because levy gives a very different connotation. Because when you levy something to somebody, it's a tax. So when it was released by then CS Rotich, he talked about it as a housing levy. And so a lot of people understood it as an extra tax. But what it was a saving, whereby you get 1.5% from me and a 1.5% from the employer, and it goes into like a wallet for the employee, and they keep on saving. And if you actually work out the numbers, because this is something we've never discussed with a lot of people, technically you're talking about 80 to 90% of the people were not going to pay more than 1,000 shillings. So you essentially are saying you pay 1,000 bucks towards your housing. If in 7 years' time you don't get a house, okay, you can withdraw your savings and you can do something else with your money. You can improve your unit. If you already say, look, why are you forcing me to save? And I already have a home, you can take it to do an improvement, or even to buy an extra unit also, and so on and so forth. So that was really the essence of the housing fund. And if it's a model that Kenyans understand, because we all understand SACCOs, we understand about contribution. So essentially what we were creating, although it was mandatory, was like a national SACCO, where everybody who was formally employed, first of all, if you have a slip, you are going to get about 1,000 bucks deducted from your pay slip, and your employer was going to contribute another 1,000 bucks towards your home. And if you don't get it, because remember, this money was going in, we were not even going to see money. We appointed fund managers. We which was Britam. We appointed an administrator, who was Zamara, and we appointed a custodial bank, which was KCB. So technically, this money is not the same that you say, no, your government is just taxing me or taking this money and I will never be able to see it. It was well ring-fenced, such that even myself as a PS cannot just go say, let's take that money and use it for COVID-19. Let's use it for this emergency and so on. It was ring-fenced, sort of kind of money. And with that, what we were going to be able to do was to go back now to the market and tell them, build. You can use your own funding. We can finance you, but you build. Here is the land we have identified. Build at scale. Here are the tax incentives that we have provided you. And at the same time, we have created a portal, which is Boma Yangu. And Kenyans are registering in great numbers. but you don't worry about the people who are going to buy. So essentially, the housing fund was coming between the Kenyans who wanted houses and the investors. And when the investors look at the Kenyans who wanted houses, they say, these fellows are not bankable. And we told them, yes, they're not bankable, but that is not your problem. You build, we'll pay you, okay, for whatever units that you have built, and you exit and you go build the next one. Then we shall be left with the process of allocation. And we're going to create we created a transparent process of allocating those units. Because I don't want to really go into a lot of the details, because this is work that went on for quite long. That was really what we believed was that silver bullet. This is the way we were going to be able to address, even attempt getting close to the 500,000 homes, because now we had land was sorted out, we had risk was taken out in terms of market risk, which was the biggest risk for the investors, because, as I say, they will understand you and I. Yes, we are probably a bit in the higher echelons of the society. So for them, looking at me and you as a client, okay, fine, I can build for you. I know you're not default. I can walk into a bank and get a mortgage. But when you're talking about the majority of the people who are addressing, they could not even walk into a bank and even get an audience. So that was how we were going to address it. Unfortunately, we had 11 court cases, and the reality of the matter is there was a lot of abuse of court processes, and of course, with the kind of constitution we have, which is also very allows someone to sue for you and so on and so forth. But the thing that is very sad for me is that the majority of the people that actually went to court, on a public interest basis. These are, if it was people who are representing the workers, these guys have beach houses, they have, I don't know, a ranch, they have 4-5 housing units that they are enjoying today, but yet they're there speaking for you, saying that they represent your interest. We had MPs that went in there. When you say, okay, you as an MP, you had a chance to go in Parliament, because this thing went through Parliament, and they almost wanted to extort money from us. So there was a lot of frustration with court processes, and this thing was made voluntary. Now, what was lost, and this is the point I want to end this bit with, was when you look at the aggregation from the average 2.6 million Kenyans who were going to be, forcefully, made to save money, we were going to be collecting 9 billion shillings a month. 9 billion shillings from savings. Now, you give me 9 billion shillings every month, and I will turn this country into a massive construction site. There will be jobs for all of your chapters, architects, QSs, and that's how we are going to be able to address the scale. If you look at what happened after we made it voluntary, it was made voluntary in December of 2019, when the president announced in Jamhuri Day that he was just tired of, people just frustrating this process. And from that moment to date, we've collected slightly under 2 billion, about 1.8, 1.9. That is what we've collected in those many months. And that is against 9 billion every month that we're going to be able to collect. Now, when you look at the budgetary allocation, because the State Department of Housing fights for budget like everybody else, I, without any fear of contradiction, and forget about sometimes what the Minister of Finance will come and announce as the amount of money that has been given towards affordable housing. Sometimes they will give figures and we will be asking, where is that money? The reality of the matter is, in one particular year, we never got more than 1.5 billion. We never got more than 1.5 billion, and that is budget. And then you have got to go and look at the actual exchequer. So I can tell you that from the budget point of view, we never received more than 6, and even 6 billion is on the way higher side. We never received more than 4 billion towards affordable housing. So therefore, you then solve the question, then how are you going to address these 500,000 homes? You have no money, you have no tax to get, no saving, and again, debt is a big one issue. So let me pause there, because I know just from that I have generated enough sort of debate, and I'll be happy to take a few questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Bernard. Yes, indeed, we hope you can stay on. And I hear you had a very big, in fact, it sounds insurmountable task of moving from these really little numbers to quite a number. I believe that was not achieved. I would like to hear you maybe even chat on the chat, you could just indicate in terms of numbers what has been achieved so far against that very huge target. And you clearly mentioned the issues that are not very alien in terms of the land ecosystem, the cost of it, and the ridiculous percentage of that accounts to the value of the land against the value of development, which does not make sense. And then, of course, the cost of construction, which 70,000 per square meter, any average GSE will tell you that's probably the rate of building a high-end hotel. Most Nairobians build for less than 30,000 per square meter. So really that cost in itself, whether it is real or probably people taking advantage of the government projects, is another story. And of course, the issues of taxations, which are very high. Finance not being available, both in the supply and the demand side. And you clearly state that you are looking at, how does someone spend less than 30,000 of their disposable income? If you look at the majority of Kenyans who earn less than 20,000 shillings gross, is that amount of money of 30% of that enough to get a mortgage? And lastly, I think what the issue that you pointed out of the cases you learned from other countries which have been successful in this sector is the issue of the savings. And this is the culture. The culture of savings is incumbent on the end users. I believe Kenya has a very low rate of savings in the world, and that can contribute to the fact that we might not be able to do that. But the question would be on this housing fund, the issues of the people having the faith and the belief that the fund would be successful. Never mind the court cases, but I believe maybe it's something that could be addressed. And hopefully, you, as you think about the recommendation for the next government, maybe just highlight what is the one thing that could be done. Is it possible that maybe the department could have just focused on enabling the environment rather than try to to build with, so that then you would give that task to the other people who would be able to do that, like financiers and the developers and the homeowners themselves. So I think there's a lot of questions to be answered, and I hope this session might not be sufficient, but we will start to look at that and move forward. I want to say that the program definitely is going to be overrun. The next speakers, their topics, their questions within the time we have, then we open up for the audience. I want to now bring in Professor Omenya on this land question, which I think has been very well put. And in Kenya, is a question of accessibility, really. Is it something that most Kenyans can afford? And please, let me just throw it back to Professor Piesinga as another question, that maybe we also need to look at the question of the people who can afford housing. And I want to speak to a lot of people who are in this. How many of these people here, maybe just in the chat, how many of you are homeowners? Because we might be looking at just the lower cadre of economic ladder, but then you might find most average Kenyans cannot afford a house in the first place. So maybe just as a question which maybe the PS might want to look at. But Prof, the land question, accessibility, cost, servicing of the land for settlement in Kenya. How could this be addressed? And then I also want you to just, in the same line, look at the issues. We talk about affordable housing. There's also the other typology, which is the social housing, which is not about owning a house, but being able to access houses, cheap rent, and houses which is adequate. So, Prof, how best do we look at this question of land, and how do we create an enabling environment for land for purposes of settlement in Kenya? Karibu sana, Professor Omena.
No, thank you very much, George Arabu. I hope I can be heard. George, can you? Yes, I think I can be heard.
Yes, you are clear, Prof.
Great. And thanks the two speakers who've gone ahead of me. Of course, thanks AK for setting this particular platform for engagement at Yamadete and PS Charles Singer for always honoring us with your presence, so that you can reflect and debate on some of the issues that that government is doing in terms of housing. And yes, I mean, sometimes I sympathize with you, sometimes of course we criticize you, but you had a near impossible task, as it actually were, to deliver some houses. George, I would like to start from the beginning. that may sound a bit, tautological, but I would like to start from the beginning. I think one of the issues that we need to engage with as a country is to ask more fundamental questions rather than rush to solutions. And what I mean is this: I mean, what housing problem have we been trying to solve? And this is the issue. In fact, what should be asking is really what is the problem in the first instance? And even before we ask that question, we should be asking even a more fundamental question: what is housing? Is it the same as just delivery of houses? And can housing be solved by simply building units? Eventually, I want to just highlight a little bit of this. What is social housing, for example? Most of these questions we are asking are not new, and the definitions are not alien. I mean, some of these are things that have been defined for several years, but for some reason, we don't seem to understand them. At least those of us who are in the realm of housing know there's a distinction between a house or houses as in buildings and housing per se, and what that housing entails. Government, of course, has dealt with very, very many different aspects of this. But you see, this leads us to another question. Then how do we solve the housing problem, supposing we actually understand it? Yes, so let me just highlight very, very quickly that I see a number of governments, and not just Kenyan government. This was also partly a bit of a problem with South African government, but I see a lot of governments confusing the housing question with a question of delivery of houses. The housing question is really about improvement of the overall conditions in which people live, which includes houses and includes services and so on. And that particular condition can be improved significantly, without even putting up one building. That is actually one of the issues that we need to engage with. The second issue that we actually need to engage is social housing. What is actually social housing? And in the government program, social housing was simply defined as a particular type of house based on affordability and income. Globally, and for very many years, social housing has always been defined. It has several features. It has always been defined as public housing. In many instances, it's been defined as rental housing. In many instances, it's been defined as subsidized rental housing, and so on and so forth. But largely, home ownership has never really been core to social housing. Even a situation where social housing is provided by social institutions, like churches or not-for-profit organizations and so on and so forth. And there's an issue that without understanding the problem we are trying to solve, we are likely to generate solutions that are largely irrelevant. So I mean, coming back to the housing question, what is Kenya's housing problem exactly were, and what is its petty deficit? And I'll pose further questions to this. The people who live in slums and informal settlements, do they have housing? The people who live in inadequate rural settlement, do they have housing? The people who cannot afford rent, do they actually have housing, and so on and so forth? So I start wondering at what point we made a decision that ownership of low income would actually be a solution. Yeah, because if we start looking at a housing problem from those sort of perspectives, then we are likely to generate a solution that is totally different. We have a situation whether you're looking at slums and informal settlements, whether you're looking at low-income housing, whether you look at middle-income housing, where up to 70% of the country are actually renting, and then you actually have a housing solution that basically has a very thin rent to own, but the entire housing policy is based on home ownership. Is it even desirable to turn everybody into home owner? Is it even realistic in the first instance? Can we make rental more affordable? And so on and so forth. So anyway, we ended up with this particular situation where we're bogged down to building houses, and again, one wonders the extent to which governments can actually do this. But even on the question of building houses, if you walk with me still in terms of asking questions, a very basic question: where do Kenyans live? All these Kenyans, 54 million of them, where do they live? They live in one sort of a house or another. Has that house been built by government? The answer is no, really. I mean, what government has provided as housing is negligible. So who's building these houses? Have they been built by the Chinese? No. The answer is that these houses have been delivered either through self-build or individuals building few houses here and there, and so on. And yes, as PS says, I mean, there have been quite a bit of mechanisms that would improve the delivery of this sort of housing. But the other question I would have asked, really, if I was in government, was that what is the problem with this model of delivery? Can government actually come in and improve that? And of course, again, agreeing with the PS, there were mechanisms that would actually be enabled to to start dealing with with some of those issues. So the point I'm trying to say here is that generally the government of Kenya was answering the wrong question vigorously, and yes, some houses were actually provided, and a lot of mechanisms were provided to deliver materials and so on and so forth. But then at the end of the day, this did not actually solve the problem of homelessness in the country, did not solve the problem of poor quality housing stock, did not solve the problem, again, as PS was highlighting there, of housing affordability in terms of the amount of money people are spending in housing and the quality of that very housing. Yes, so don't sit here and pretend that I'm one of those people who've been pleased with Kenya government housing solution. In fact, as far as the market is concerned, Kenya government has no housing policy. They enabled a few people to build some houses here and there, but otherwise those particular houses could not and cannot and should never really be used to deal with the inadequate housing that we have of literally half the population in the country, whether you're looking at inadequate housing in urban areas, or you're looking at totally inadequate housing in rural areas, as it actually were. And this is the question that ties it with land. Of course, we appreciate what had been done, but like we're saying, it's like trying to solve the public transport problem by buying a few Ferraris. At the end of the day, you have some nice cars, but on the other hand, majority of the people will continue, in the misery in terms of the day-to-day situation as it actually were. And yes, so not to bash government too much. I mean, this same government and previous governments have done some pretty interesting things, and I'm linking that to the land question. Government has done some pretty interesting things, through programs like Kenya Urban Support Program, which was not necessarily targeting housing directly, but I think KSIP targeted housing in a lot more direct way. in slums and informal settlements, and quite a number of got titles. And what's amazing is that as soon as people got some sort of security of tenure, not even a full title, you know, the housing condition would actually improve almost immediately. And people were then, you know, had the confidence to start investing you know, in these areas. We see these in places like Ziwa la Ng'ombe in Mombasa, Kwabulo in Mombasa, where the titles have not even been given. But just the promise of the title alone starts improving the housing situation. While I'm not saying that what government did was totally inappropriate, but then, of course, I mean, it was not going to solve the problem. So my point is that, yes, housing stock is important. We must increase it. We must solve the problem of low income and middle income housing and so on and so forth. But to be able to deal with the problem of the majority in housing, we must start focusing on land and how we improve, not just, you know, land that you put up flats as exactly were, but you know, securing tenure, particularly for places for informal areas, or, you know, starting to put infrastructure and services in these informal areas, so that the housing condition of the majority, you know, of Kenyans can actually improve, both urban and rural. Linked again with this particular question of land, and again the PS highlighted a little bit of that in terms of saving and a saving culture. The other thing that I've always said, and it really is about the nature of informality, and trying to use formal systems to solve problems in informal areas. Majority of Kenyans live in formal settlements. They have informal jobs and so on. So to imagine that you'll actually create a totally formal system to respond to the housing, and here I'm speaking specifically on financial instruments, you know, to deal with the issues, and you will not be able to crack this. In a way, you need to start from where they are and take into cognizance that some of these people will actually die, you know, in these informal areas, and the question comes, what can you actually you know, do to improve their lot, so that you know, while they're still alive around here, you know, they actually have life that is a little bit bearable. But if you say, okay, fine, that you want to give this person a mortgage, even if you make it a multi-generational mortgage, a mortgage is not structured to respond to informal incomes that can be quite erratic and sometimes not even guaranteed in terms of long-term housing solution as it actually were. Yeah, so I think moving forward, we have quite a bit of things that government has already done that I think should just stay, but they will not necessarily stay because they're solving the problem as they actually were. They would stay because you know, as a housing expert, any housing stock is always useful, including even housing for the high income. Once you provide that, then of course you sort out the problem that we call downgrading. It means that if a particular class is provided for, then in fact you cushion the lower classes from you know, from the houses being you know, snatched away from them by the higher classes. So yes, I mean, for me, any type of stock that is delivered, be it by private sector, be it for the high income, be it for the middle income, whatever it is actually good for housing. But on the other hand, it's like saying you're going to solve the problem of poverty by you know, increasing Omenya's salary. It can make a contribution, but you must ask yourself, who is this poor person? What do they actually do? How can we ensure that we have targeted interventions that may actually bring relief to this particular class of people? And as I continue making my point, we need to actually designated planned areas where you actually have social housing or even low-income housing. As the CS correctly says, the cost of land in Nairobi and in many parts of the country is actually quite obscene. And this is where we need to have the link between you know, planning, enforcement of plans, the planners in the room ensuring that we don't misuse that instrument that you like, the change of use, so that areas that have been ring-fenced for public facilities, areas have been ring-fenced for social housing, actually be used strictly for those. That is the only way we can actually protect property values in those areas. But if you're able to convert, you know, the use to malls and commercial buildings and so on, and then you'll end up with the situation we are in Nairobi, where the only way you can actually provide low-income housing in Nairobi is to build it in another county, and try to solve the the problem through transport. But we must actually understand this thing. As I wind up my contribution, we must actually understand the issue of land from the perspective of security of tenure. That access to land is not simply getting cheap land for the developer. The developer is in this thing for profit, actually, and they will, as long as you got a market, that where demand is higher than supply, the cost will always go up regardless of what you actually do. And this particular thing, but the most significant thing is to improve people's housing situations exactly where they are, because that is the only way to ensure that they don't get displaced by developers. And it also means that once people get their title and so on, yes, some will sell and shift to other areas, but some can actually improve their housing conditions gradually, and the risk of being displaced is would almost be nil. Yes, like the poultry houses the government has actually developed. The sad thing about them is that they've resulted in more people actually being evicted, as a result of those developments. And in fact, I just finished a study, State of Housing Report, Volume 3, that we're involved with Haki Jamii. We didn't find one single beneficiary of the people who are living in those particular places. Hence, the comment that is government destroying more houses than it is actually building. That you go here and the people that you've actually displaced are way more than the people that you'll be accommodating in your new housing, in actually causing the problem. So anyway, the point I'm trying to make here is that the only way to solve the housing problem is to understand it, is to ask housing for who? And what is the current status of these individuals? And what is the structure of their income? And who's building the houses, where they in slums or in the Umojas and the Kayoles and Zimmermans of this world and so on? Who are those people who are building there? And then start asking fundamental questions. How can we partner with these people to improve those broader environments? What can government do? Of course, we expect government to do a raft of issues that the PS has highlighted there, plus putting infrastructure and services. But I don't think it is government's role, or even government's place, or even government's competence to actually build, the houses themselves. And of course, as a wind up, once you start understanding the issue, if Kenya is actually a country of renters, can you actually solve Kenya's housing problem by turning everybody or by having a housing approach or solution that is only focused on home ownership? In fact, rent to own is actually home ownership. Why bogging down people? Why giving people burdens of home ownership? That they cannot not be able to actually afford, and then of course start affecting their other livelihoods. It's quite interesting. The most successful, not even successful, I mean, but the program that has delivered, big numbers of houses, and which the PS is very familiar with, is the South African Housing Program. This program from 1994 has delivered 3.3 million houses and 1.1 million service sites. This actually translates to 180,000 houses per year. It's mind-blowing what this program has done in 18 years. But will this actually solve the housing problem in South Africa? It won't. In fact, they started by doing these houses, and of course, the South African government shifted to the People's Housing Process, which I designed myself, and that was basically to improve, people's conditions where they are, inner city housing, eventually slum upgrading, and sites and services and so on. The only way you can deal with the housing problem, given is diabolic nature, if I can actually say that it is a notoriously difficult problem to diagnose and even to cure. The only way to deal with the housing problem is to actually have a multifaceted housing policy that then has different instruments within it to deal with difference, whether you're looking at sites and services on one side, whether you're looking at slum upgrading on the other side, whether you're looking at security of tenure and titling on the other side, whether you're looking at rental housing on this other side, whether you're looking, of course, on capital subsidy housing and so on. And this entire basket is now what will actually start enabling you to actually realize bits of these houses. But having said that, of course, kudos to government. At least we can talk about some housing. There was zero housing before the Jubilee government came into office. And I think they missed the point 100%, but at least we can actually learn lessons from the government, moving forward and see what can be applied. I suspect the next government will do exactly the same, because governments are notorious in terms of absorbing even common sense. Thank you so much, George. Back to you.
Oh, wow. Thanks, Prof. And you pose important rhetorical questions, but I believe this will trigger a lot of discussions around how we actually answering the problem. We have a complete different question from the question book. And indeed, as you're saying, the challenges that we are facing here are even possible diagnosing what the main issue is and trying to tackle it. As you just alluded to the issues of dealing with the problem and trying to resolve people's problems they are, I think that starts to answer to the question of land, because once someone has land, then at that point, it's actually possible to start dealing with enabling them to build for themselves rather than providing a house for them. We've also just quickly looked at the issues of differentiating in the housing, because housing is an all-encompassing infrastructural issue, connecting other services and utilities. But rather, if we look at it from the point of just the house, that it starts to bring in other challenges. You've also just spoken to the fact that majority of Kenyans are renters, and what then are we trying to resolve by dealing with the issues of home ownership? And lastly, just to mention, you are also looking at proposing a multifaceted housing policy that basically provides an enabling environment for people to be able to develop housing for themselves rather than being given handouts. And let me just say that one of the questions that I have there as a general question was issues of having private developers and financiers leading this charge to getting adequate housing for everyone. I believe, Prof, what you just mentioned here, that this is not a very sustainable method. So how do we change this tide? I would like to pose that question, of course, to all our panelists, so that when you come back, you can also look at. You've alluded to the next speaker's question, but I would like to call Sandra Oyombe from Haki Jamii. Sorry. Yes, you want to say something? Can I give you a minute so that?
I needed to.
Yes,
I had indicated that I was not going to be able to stay for the entire period. So, if you allow me to jump off, but there's just two quick points I just wanted to make before I jump off. One is a response to the person, I think it was Etta, that I found making comments towards the tail end of her presentation, and the other one to Professor Menya. I will endeavor to deal with whatever issues that I have and see if I can be able to multitask. But I have a bit of an emergency that I needed to sort of deal with. So if you allow me quickly, from Etta's submission, I did not really get the entire context, but I did find her making the statement that housing has been clubbed together with things like manufacturing and so on and so forth. That sort of I think either cause confusion or and I just wanted to say very, very quickly that it's very, very important to understand, and that's why housing, and maybe this also touches on Professor Menya as well, that the reason why governments have put housing as a key pillar is not because, Professor Menya, your last statement was that governments are notorious for not having common sense. I think that is a statement in bad taste. But you need to understand that the delivery of housing is not just about four walls and a roof. You need to understand the importance of housing in the entire economy equation as well. So there are many birds that are being solved, even as you provide decent roofing for our people. So if you can be able to provide housing at scale, then you're able to provide the so much needed jobs. Right now, the most topical issue in Kenya is about jobs, and good jobs. Now, how are governments going to provide jobs? It's governments are not supposed to be the employers. They are supposed to provide an environment that can be able to provide the quality jobs. So a lot of the manifestos that you saw, even in this particular election, housing was still a core pillar of those manifestos. And I have a great deal of respect for the people that, and if you take the two leading formations that actually went into, looking at how they can improve on what Jubilee did. But there is no way you're going to get this country working if you cannot get people into working in especially in this particular sector. Now, housing, or let's call it the built environment, is one when there is a pandemic or an economic meltdown, it gets affected very fast. But also it is one of those sectors that is able to come out of those pandemics and economic meltdown faster than other sectors. And if you go as far back as the Great Depression that happens in the late 20s and early 30s, they used what we call extended public works. Extended public works was one of the tools that they used to sort of jolt the economy. Now, our sector, and sometimes we talk down on it, and I don't think we should talk down on it. We should actually be the people that amplify the point that this is a sector that deserves a lot more attention, because this is a sector that is labor intensive. It is labor intensive. So forget about all these academic and whatever other issues that we can battle around, which model, that model, rent versus own, and own versus rent to own, and so on and so forth. There is no doubt that when you look at economic sectors, there is no sector that has the capacity to employ more people than our sector. On average, one unit, you can be able to create 5 direct jobs. You can be able to create another 7 indirect jobs. If you talk about able to scale, whether it is big enterprise and small enterprises, they are all contained in our sector, because our sector has a very long supply chain. And so if you cannot be able to understand that nexus, then you cannot be able to understand why governments continue to put housing as a core pillar. So it's not because bureaucrats are foolish and they basically spend their days not listening to the market, but there are fundamental issues that cause bureaucrats to put housing as a core pillar to the economy. You cannot talk about manufacturing in this country and not talk about housing. What are you manufacturing? When you look at the entire manufacturing, in fact, my view is you get the housing sector right from a policy, from whatever else you want to do, and your manufacturing works. Because what are you going to manufacture? What are we manufacturing in this country? You see? Now, the common sense economic model, forget about these other economic models that you've heard about. The common sense economic model says create a consumptive demand. create a consumptive demand. Once you create a consumptive demand, then the supply side works. Now, how do you create a consumptive demand? I believe that when we made housing as a core pillar, we created a consumptive demand. And of course, I partly agree that not everybody is going to own those homes. But there is a fundamental question that you as the elite in our sector need to ask and answer. Do people rent because they want to rent, or they rent because they cannot afford to own? And if there is a way in which you can be able to solve the question of ownership and affordability, why not solve it? Because I would rather own. I believe all of you, Professor Omenya and everybody else here.
How many people, what appears, how many people did you enable to own houses? Back to your question. I mean, if you set out to get 500,000 people own houses, how many people were you able to get to own houses? What you're saying is that that particular model that you had didn't even work on the basis of your own targets. Really?
No. The model did not work, and that's what I spend a lot of time saying. The model did not work because of the frustration that we had in the courts. It's not because it has not worked in other places. You know, you cite South Africa as an example. South Africa, they have subsidized those houses. That is tax money. Do we have the kind of money that South Africa has from all the platinum and the gold and the diamond that they are mining, that they are able to subsidize?
And that is why you should have abandoned it, because as a country, we can't afford it. We can't afford it as a country. So why was government pursuing that in the first years?
No. But you see, what I'm basically trying to say is we did not necessarily adopt the South African model. We adopted a model that has worked in other places. The collective saving. When you look at Singapore, it has worked. 90% of the people there live in public housing. And it's not perfect. Mexico is not perfect. But we looked at building on places that have worked. But be as it may, the issue, and I think this was the ETA's issue, of why we are clubbing housing together with manufacturing. You cannot be further away from the reality, is because housing and manufacturing are linked right by the hip. You know, even you talk about the cottage sector, think about it. If you take 500,000 homes as an example, if you're able to achieve that particular target, however insurmountable it looks like, you are talking about almost 40 million bags of cement. You're talking about 18 million tons of steel. You're talking about 5 million tons of nails, musumari, that you're talking about. You're talking about almost 10 million, or is it about 10 million doors or thereof, because in each house you have an average of about 5 to 7 doors. So the point I'm just trying to say is that you cannot solve the issue of creating jobs if you don't think about scale. And the way you scale is by having a sector like housing. And I want to ask my good Professor Omenya, for example, if you don't think that we have a challenge, when we did the first housing unit, that is Park Road, which was 1,370 units. And 50% of those units, because Park Road is actually on public land, it is civil servants' land. So we gave the civil servants and the police the 50%, 60% of those particular units. So for the rest of the public, we had less than 600 units that were available for the rest of the public. So if we don't have a problem, why did 33,000 people pay deposit and they raised their hands and they said that we want a house? Why did most of them say, please don't refund me, because I would rather wait in the queue for the next housing development that is going to come at scale? So I think it's important that we are able to put things into context so that we also don't lose very good points that you're making, which can be able to enrich the particular process. The one thing that I agree with 100% is the issue of rent. Is that we need to look at the rental options, and I am the first one to admit that outside the rent to own model that we looked at, we perhaps did maybe we downscaled the importance of rental in the program. I think that's one of the areas that needs to be somehow improved on. On the issue of the enabling environment, I just want to put some few numbers. Number one, and you, Professor Omenya, I think you are part of the particular program. I think you mentioned it. You were part of the KISIP, you're part of the KUSP program, and you saw, I mean, we disbursed about 30 billion shillings to the counties. One of the things that we wanted the counties to do with that money was to put infrastructure that will be able to promote housing. Now, with KISIP, yes, you are right. We were able to achieve actually improvement of housing in some of those areas, and I don't want to take credit for this. So if you go to, for example, Saali in Malindi, Kibokoni, even Kwaronda and Kaptembwa in Nakuru, if you are to go there today and you're told that this used to be an informal settlement, you will actually refuse, because the type of housing that you see there is not a house that is synonymous to informal settlements. So yes, one of the greatest achievement was provide this horizontal infrastructure in some of these areas, and automatically they actually ended up improving the housing. The last question that I have for Professor Omenya, because when you make statements, and I have seen it as well in your Twitter, on the issue of people that were displaced vis-a-vis the people that, people were evicted and displaced. But my question is, which area are you talking about? Because of all the large-scale housings that we have undertaken, those was displaced. Number two, the only one that is complete is only Park Road. And we actually put a public advertisement in the papers looking for the original 39 owners that were there in Park Road, because we had made it a very clear point that they will be the first one to be allocated housing. Now, all the other houses, maybe when you talk about Buxton in Mombasa, the people who vacated Buxton are the first one that have been given their allotment letters. So I am not quite sure, maybe unless you're making reference to something else, but at the moment there is outside Park Road of all the public housing that and completed, and where you can be able to say we displaced people and they were not beneficiaries. It's only Park Road that you can only talk about. Pangani, people were given money to vacate, to go. In fact, they were given a huge check. And I hope one of the things that in your discussion here you can discuss is, because we have to densify, is where there is already existing settlements, what is a fair compensation price? Because the minute you distort the market, like the Sonko government did, when you go and pay one person 600,000 shillings to vacate sites, are you able to replicate that when you look at, for example, Eastland's master plan, which has been done and it's a public document, and we want to move from 40,000, the Eastlands originally had 17,000 units. We want to densify that to about 160 to 200,000. How are you going to do that by paying 600,000? So, and I can see the moderator is
allow me. But yes, allow me to cut you short, because I still have 4 speakers, but I think I would like you to stay on, even if it's in between your emergency, because I believe there's still some reactions that you're going to get from even the audience. I hope you don't exit completely. But just allow me to reiterate what I believe I understood from Eta's question on the issue of the housing and other infrastructure. And I believe most of our cities have a very high percentage of residential buildings. In fact, up to 90% of all drawings that are submitted for approvals are actually residential. And I think what she was alluding to was the issue of prioritizing housing, and then everything else is planned around the housing rather than the other way around. where, for example, informal settlements come up next to factories because people want to work. Is it possible that we could be looking at housing planned and then provisions for where the people are going to work? And I think that's what she alluded to, but maybe she'll come in later and clarify that. But at the same time, I think there's a lot of discussions between Prof and PS, because that question of displacement, where is it and is it real? Because these were studies that were done and the figures are provided, and we're looking at the slum upgrading projects, for example. But allow me to bring in, there's 3 ladies lined up and then a last gentleman, so that we can have at least all voices on the table. Is Sandra Oyombe from Haki Jamii here with us? If she is, I can go ahead and ask her the question. Sandra, you can unmute and just say yes, you are here.
Yes, I am here using a different.
Oh, fantastic! I can see you're using someone else's handle. Okay, so Sandra, Prof alluded to the issues of land tenure. I just wanted you to speak to the issue of the status of the land tenure and forced evictions in the last 10 years, because these are real statistics that have been done in terms of studies. And how do we look at the tomorrow cities? Is it possible to actually plan tomorrow cities without displacing people? Sandra, please take the mic.
Thank you. First of all, thank you, Abu, for the opportunity to have me in this space that is addressing the questions of affordable housing in Kenya. The lessons for the new government, I think it is quite timely based on the political context in which we are operating. So I would also like to thank the speakers who have spoken before me and highlighted key issues around questions of affordable housing. And at the tail end, we have had quite a lot of discussions around evictions and whether indeed government has evicted certain people as it tried to implement the various the program on affordable housing. You have asked me the question to speak on the land tenure system and evictions in Kenya, and I think I will narrow down to the legal and policy framework that governs questions of land tenure and in the context of adequate or the right to housing, and also look at the laws and policies governing evictions in this country. I think that was what I was guided to speak on. And then lastly, address the question of whether can have cities or develop cities without displacing or evicting people moving forward. I think I will begin by saying that Kenya has, over the past 10 or so years, developed quite progressive legislations and that have attempted to address the different typologies of land tenure systems that we have in this country, as well as the question of forced evictions. I will not go in depthly, but I'll try to summarize some of them because you can always refer to them as you take notes. We have the National Land Policy, which stipulates several measures of safeguarding land rights, and including putting in place appropriate legal framework for evictions, which is in line with international accepted guidelines. And based on that, the Constitution built on that, because the National Land Policy set out the framework, and the Constitution under Article 40 recognizes the right of every person, either individually or in association with others, to acquire and own land. We also have Article 43, which recognizes and provides for the economic and social rights of people. And under that article, it recognizes the right to accessible and adequate housing and reasonable standards of sanitation. So these provisions of the Constitution are the benchmark or the yardstick to which the guarantee of some degree of security of tenure and legal protection against evictions and harassment or any other threats is founded on. And then these specific rights under the Constitution also create obligations on the state to protect people's property and also to improve the housing and living conditions rather than destroying or damaging them. So the Constitution lays the foundation for the rights guaranteed for the protection of land or property, as well as guaranteeing the right to accessible and adequate housing and reasonable standards of sanitation. So based on these rights that have been guaranteed, the various pieces of legislation were set up to address the various typologies of land tenure systems in Kenya. I will not delve so on that. We'll just focus mainly on the legislation that addresses questions of eviction. But it is good to point out that there have been various land reforms in the country which have resulted in the development of the Land Act, the Land Registration Act, which stipulates a procedure for acquisition and ownership of land, as well as the Community Land Act, which now recognizes how ownership of community land by those who are registered as community members. So those are the various typologies of land tenure system, which inform the question of ownership of land in this country. The Land Laws Amendment Act of 2016 incorporated certain provisions that speak on the question of evictions, and specifically these sections range from basically you would find this under section 152A of the Land Laws Amendment Act of 2016, all the way to the various subsections within that section. And this section specifically begins by prohibiting unlawful occupation of private, community or public land, and that's the starting point, because any unlawful occupation of land that is not yours is prohibited. However, there are considerations in the law of instances where people are occupiers of these various types of land legally, and because they do not have they cannot access affordable housing, or rather their economic ability is not able to enable them to actually own or rent property, and therefore they find themselves in occupation of land that is not theirs, either as squatters or any other form of ownership or possession of that land. So the law has provided exceptions under the Land Laws Amendment Act of 2016 that has taken into consideration certain measures that where people are found to be illegally in occupation of public land, the section under the Land Laws Amendment Act, that is section 152C, provides that there should be proper notification of from the National Land Commission to these people if there is any eviction that is to be conducted. This means that a claim should have been brought to the National Land Commission and investigations done to establish that the land in which either the squatters or people who are in possession of that land have actually unlawfully occupied what we call public land, so that that decision that is made by the National Land Commission can then be gazetted and also published in one newspaper of national-wide circulation, and a radio announcement is made to that effect. So those are the procedures that have been put forth in the laws, the new Land Laws Amendment Act. And the said laws require that notice should be at least a 3 months notice, where National Land Commission is notifying the people that are likely to be affected by evictions of the intended action of removing them from that piece of land if it is public land. The same provision under Section 1(2) D also speaks of occupation of illegal or unlawful occupation of land, community land. And in this case, the law requires that a 3 months notice is, or rather the people who have occupied that land are informed, are notified of the intention to evict them through the county executive committee by issuing them with a 3 months notice and publishing the same in a gazette, and a newspaper of wide circulation, so that people are given sufficient and adequate notice of the intended intention of the county government to, or any other agency, to evict them from what may be described or found to be community land. The same provision under Section 152E recognizes the same protocol to be followed where it is private land, and that the private owner needs to issue at least a 3 months notice to the persons who are going to be affected by evictions, to be able to prepare themselves and also have various consultations or seek advice and redress where they need to. So the law is very clear on the notice. I think from the State of Housing report, quite a number of issues have emerged on the procedure and manner in which evictions have been conducted in this country without proper notification of the persons who are going to be affected by the action, either of a private owner or by a state agency that is likely to conduct or to initiate the evictions against the people who are going to be affected. And from that, there are other procedures within the same section which require that the identification of those persons who are going to be affected by the evictions is done. That means enumeration to know who within that area or informal settlement is going to be affected by the eviction process. And the eviction process, if it is to be carried out, needs to respect